He's a veteran author whose compelling books have captivated readers worldwide. With over 30 books to his name, Marshall has become a definitive voice in the realms of film, sports, and music writing. His best-selling biographies include those of Steve McQueen, Elvis Presley, Billy Graham, Johnny Cash, have received critical acclaim. He has bridged the gap between iconic historical figures and the contemporary reader. As you may remember from his first presentation, Marshall's profound insights into the lives of these legends are the result of his meticulous research and his passion for revealing the human stories behind the public personas. His acclaimed book, Steve McQueen, The Life and Legend of a Hollywood Icon, is currently being adapted into a feature film highlighting his impact on both literature and cinema. So has his documentary on Johnny Cash. This morning, he brings us a fresh perspective as on one of the most legendary partnerships in show business with his latest work, Elvis and the Colonel. This book promises to reshape our understanding of the dynamic between Elvis Presley and Colonel Parker. Through his expert storytelling, our speaker invites us into the world of showbiz, most iconic figures. For this presentation, I will be asking the questions you want the answers to. As always, there will be your own Q&A session at the end. So please welcome Marshall Terrill, and if you can spotlight him, please, Pete. And my first question, let's see, I'm going to see the speaker. There's Marshall. Wonderful, perfect. Marshall, for those who have not met you before, please give us a snapshot of your career as an author.
All right, I can do that. My career, my first book was published in 1993. So I just celebrated 30 years of publishing. And that goes by quick, as does life. In that time, I've written 30 books. I've got 3 in the can, and I just keep writing. People often ask me, how do I pick my subject? Sometimes an agent will come to me with something. Sometimes the person will come to me with something. Sometimes I'll want to do something for myself and do a passion project. And then sometimes somebody will introduce me to somebody. So I'm always kind of on the lookout to do something. And that's just kind of how I approach my work. I always try to be open to something that if I haven't done before. I like exploring subjects, just like a journalist does. They write a little bit about everything. And so when something comes along that you haven't done before, then it's always intriguing. So in this case, I had done 3 Elvis books prior to this. So I was introduced to Greg McDonald by Angie and Ruth McCartney. Those are Paul McCartney's stepsister and stepmother. And so they knew Greg, they did business with him. And he said, hey, do you know anybody that writes books? And they said, yes, actually we do. And we know the person just for you. And so I wasn't necessarily looking to do another Elvis book. But Greg said, he's gotten a bad rap over the years. I have inherited his estate. I've got all these documents, and I want to show them to you. And so I got together with him. My wife and I go to Palm Springs 3 to 4 times a year, one of our favorite places. And we got together, and he showed me these documents and showed me letters to and from Elvis, and showed that it was a very cordial, respectful relationship. And it wasn't anything that the media portrayed. And somebody had mentioned the Elvis movie earlier with Tom Hanks. And I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but that movie was about 80% fiction and 20% fact. So This book was almost a reaction to that movie because Greg was really tired of Colonel Parker getting trashed because he said Colonel Parker was a great guy. And Colonel Parker actually adopted Greg, and then Greg became his protege. And that's how he ended up with his estate.
Well, years ago, within the last presentation, you told us about the years of research when you were writing about your first book about Steve McQueen. So how does your research these days compare? Obviously, if you got a live person, that's helpful, but you probably do your own research on top of that?
I do. And when I did that first book, keep in mind I started in '89. And what I did was I moved back to Washington, D.C., where I grew up. And most of the information was there at the Library of Congress. So you had to physically get out, seek it out, find a librarian that would help you. Now everything is almost every catalog now is online, and you can do research much quicker. But there are biographies and then there are memoirs. And so with McQueen, it was a case of, I was doing the biography, I was interviewing, more than 100 people. And so that takes time. Whereas with Greg McDonald, he was the one telling me the story. But in this case, he had Colonel Parker's original manuscript that he was going to publish. It was called "What Does It Cost If It's Free?" And I read it. Greg sent it to me. It wasn't that great, but it did have his story. So Greg gave me that. I was able to change it from his first person to Greg's narrative, and then Greg put in some stories. So that book only took about 6 months, but whereas the McQueen book took 3.5 years. So when you have a live person, it's a lot easier to write their story. It usually takes 6 to 9 months, but in this case, this one took 6 months because all the information was there.
Now, tell us what surprised you most about the relationship.
Well, what surprised me the most was that Colonel Parker, again, was a very decent person, very fair-minded, and that flies in the face of all the information that's already out there. And basically, what Greg told me, what I figured out was that only Elvis and the Colonel really knew what their relationship was like, and these documents pretty much told that story. And Colonel Parker was trashed by the outside media for a couple of different reasons, and that's because they didn't know when he passed on. A lot of the Memphis Mafia members didn't have anything nice to say about him, and that's because he didn't respect them. And then of course when Elvis's estate was settled, a trustee came in and basically said Colonel Parker took 50% of everything, and that wasn't true. This judge wasn't savvy enough to understand the relationship, and basically it came down to Elvis and the Colonel that they had about 5 pots of money that they went through, and so a manager usually gets 15%, but Colonel Parker got 25% because he was exclusive to Elvis. A lot of managers manage several acts, so that was the agreement that they came to. So it's 25%. So Colonel got 25% of his movie money, 25% of his recording money, 50% of the merchandise money, and 50% of the touring. But the touring it was a joint venture partnership, and the touring required that Colonel Parker employ 10 people underneath him to prepare for these tours because they were very intensive. All the expenses of this tour, which Elvis was very excessive, it was written off the top for Elvis. And then Elvis and the Colonel shared whatever profits that were left. So that was basically, again, how they split their profits. But in the judge's mind, Colonel Parker got 50% of everything. But you have to remember Colonel Parker was not only his manager, but his publicist, his attorney, his promoter. He had about 4 or 5 different functions. So so understanding that just alone was surprising. And then in the letters to Elvis, he never got down on him. He never, he basically Elvis earned about $100 million in his lifetime. And I think taxes probably took 50% of that. And then he blew the rest of it. So Colonel Parker never managed Elvis's money. When they first started their relationship, Elvis said, "You worry about the money coming in, I'll worry about it going out." And so what Elvis did was he employed his dad, who had an eighth grade education, to manage his money. So when people talk about, well, Colonel Parker kept all his money and Elvis didn't, there was a reason for that. That's because Elvis didn't respect money.
Well, growing up poor, probably no one ever taught the whole family how to manage money.
That's correct.
Well,
And you bring up a very good point. When I was writing this book, I used to work for Charles Keating. I think I mentioned that earlier. He was a banker, worked for Lincoln Savings and Loan. And I worked a lot of young people who made a lot of big money. And when it all ended, they didn't save a dime of their money. And I could, I see that now a lot with young people and young entertainers. And I always turn to my wife and go, they're going to lose everything. And almost every entertainer that I've written about has lost their money at one point in time. The Beatles lost their song catalog. Johnny Cash lost his money several times. Steve McQueen went broke at one time. So, it just happens. And of course, when you're young, and you want to give, Elvis handed out 70 Cadillacs in his lifetime. You just can't do that.
Well, how was the relationship between Colonel Parker and Elvis's parents?
Between the parents?
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
Vernon, Elvis's father had a very good working relationship with Colonel Parker. The problem was, though, and Greg was there, is that Vernon was forever asking for money, and at one point in time, I remember the story Greg told me. He said, Colonel Parker said that he'd just given Vernon, and again, we're talking the 1950s. They were asking for $200,000. And Colonel Parker turned to Greg and said, I just gave him $100,000 last week. So they were burning through money like crazy. And Elvis was taking care of his family, taking care of his cousins, employing everybody. He had Graceland, which required a lot of upkeep, giving away cars. Later on, he had 4 jets. You just can't spend that kind of money and expect, that you're going to keep it. But his relationship with his mother, Gladys wasn't very trusting of Colonel Parker. And knowing something about the Southern mindset, because my family's from Arkansas, Southerners are very weary of quote unquote outsiders. So I don't think that she had a lot of trust in him. But that was her own thing. He had never done anything I felt that violated Elvis's trust or took excessive money.
Now, tell us about the merchandising. I read something about that would surprise us about the merch. And was Elvis one of the first people to really have merchandise?
I think so. And Colonel Parker had done tours with other artists, but Elvis, for some reason, this was the first post-World War, idol, and so the kids had their own money. And they were willing and able to purchase merchandise. And so Colonel Parker knew that half of the teens, the boys in particular, because they were jealous, didn't like Elvis. And so he created these buttons called I Hate Elvis. And so the boys would buy that. And then he created these buttons that said I Love Elvis. And all the girls would buy that. And so, he was able to capitalize on those sorts of things. And he started selling photo books, T-shirts, pretty much concert merchandise that you see today is what Colonel Parker started for Elvis.
Well, what were some of your favorite stories that we'll read in the book?
I've selected 4 quick stories that I want to read to you that will give you a flavor rather than me trying to recount it.
Okay, sure.
I'll try to read this quickly. So
we want to enjoy it.
Okay. Well, Colonel Parker, when he was from the Netherlands. So when he came to this country, he pretty much hoboed around the country. So this is an instance where it was one of his first times in America. And so I'll start with this story. The road was harsh and filled with plenty of rough characters. Loners like him were usually the first targets. Once the colonel recalled to me, that's Greg, a time when he encountered a gang of bullies who wanted everything he had. While he didn't have much, he was eager to part with the belongings he did have. For that, he was severely beaten. It was one of the low points of his life. He was lost, hurt, and angry. He figured it couldn't get much worse, but then it began to rain. He continued down the narrow dirt road until he saw a house with the lights on. In desperation, he stopped, knocked on the door, and asked if he could sleep under their front porch until it stopped raining. The occupants of the home insisted he come in out of the rain, genuinely concerned about his condition. He informed them of his plight, and the women of the house cleaned his wounds and fed him. He was sincerely moved by their generosity. They were a poor Black family and had several young mouths to feed, yet they were willing to share whatever they had with him. They insisted he remain with them until the rain stopped and he was strong enough to travel. Several days later, he thanked the family and left, refusing to take the food that they had offered him. A short distance from the house, he ran into a group of white men who surrounded him. "Inward lover," they shouted, "you've been living with them." Once again, he was savagely beaten and left lying in the road. Years later, he recalled the encounter to me. It made me realize how hard it was for Black people to live in America, especially in the Deep South. Quote, "I never forgot that experience," he told me. "Kindness and goodness can be any color. Meanness and cruelty can also be any color. What counts is what is within." I read that story because people don't really know the heart of Colonel Parker. And I thought that was one of the ones that, truly showed who he was. And that was the kind of wisdom that he dispensed to a lot of people. Okay, so this is the carnival days. And this kind of shows you how clever his mind worked.
Okay.
Okay, so the setting is that they go to this town and it rains and the carnival can't really get off the ground. And so Colonel Parker is really in charge. He's in charge of the groceries. And what he has to do is he has to find a grocer who's willing to front them the groceries for their stay. And then they get reimbursed once the carnival money comes in. So the carnival posted a sign reading "held over by popular demand" and hoped for improved weather and enough business to at least pay their food bill. Tom found out the grocer was a widower and invited him to enjoy the carnival as his guest. Quote, "We have a little lady with the show, and I'm sure you will enjoy meeting her," he informed the widower. The tent where the beautiful exotic dancer Little Egypt was going through her routines was their first stop. The lonely grocer thoroughly enjoyed the performance. Tom then invited him to have dinner in the cookhouse where the sultry and well-endowed hooch dancer and her mother were conveniently seated at his table. Of course, the grocer was instantly smitten and continued to visit the cookhouse on a regular basis. The weather remained miserable, and the show made little money in Jackson. They stayed a full 3 weeks, running up a considerable grocery bill. But credit was not hard to come by with the love-struck grocer. When it came time to move on to Meridian, Mississippi, the grocer was invited to come along. But this time the grocer was also hooked on Little Egypt, that he would have followed her to the real Egypt. Meridian was just a stone's throw for this guy, who was happy to make the 90-minute drive. Fortunately, the weather cleared and business improved in Meridian, so they were able to pay him in full. At this point, Little Egypt suddenly remembered a fiance back in Tampa, which dashed the romantic hopes of the grocer, who returned home alone to the Mississippi Delta.
Oh, how sad.
It does sound sad. I don't know why it strikes me as funny, but that's the kind of wit and grit that they had to learn, while out on the road.
Huh.
Okay, now we're into the show business years, and Colonel Parker is now with Abe Lasfogel. Abe Lasfogel is a historical figure in Hollywood. He started the William Morris Agency. He's the template for all the Hollywood managers. So Colonel Parker, who has no experience with movies, is negotiating Elvis's first contract with his first movie, Love Me Tender. So this kind of shows you Colonel Parker's mindset when it comes to going for broke. Okay. In April 1956, Colonel Parker flew to Los Angeles, where Lassvogel wished him to the exclusive Hillcrest Country Club on Pico Boulevard to meet Hal Wallace, who was the Paramount producer. They were there to negotiate a deal for Elvis's first feature film, Love Me Tender, for 20th Century Fox, starring Deborah Paget and Richard Egan, who grew sideburns to play Elvis's older brother. At first, the studio wanted to sign Elvis to a contract star for around $700 a week. The Colonel rejected that idea immediately. Not only did he want a $15,000 salary for Elvis for 4 weeks of work, but he also demanded a percentage of the gross profits. Lassvogel could not believe his ears. A percentage deal was virtually unheard of at that time, especially for someone who had never acted before, not even in a high school play. Wallace was aghast. The Colonel quietly pointed out that they wanted Elvis in the movies because they knew his millions of fans would buy tickets. It's as simple as that, the Colonel said. Lassvogel wasn't sold. He leaned over and whispered to Parker that he was overreaching. Colonel, you're losing this deal for us. Colonel Parker looked Lassvogel dead in the eye and said, Abe, you can't lose something you don't have. It's just not done this way, Lassvogel said. With that, the Colonel got up from the table and walked out of the meeting. A few hours later, he received a call at the Beverly Hills Wilshire Hotel. Okay, conceded Wallace, you have a piece of the action.
That was very gutsy.
Yeah, that line is you can't, what did he say? You can't lose something you don't have. And truly, Colonel Parker got Elvis Presley the best deals in entertainment. Yeah. It wasn't even close. And then last one I have, somebody mentioned Anne Margaret. So, as you know, the two started Viva Las Vegas. They had a relationship, and Anne was complaining to Elvis that her manager just wasn't cutting it. And so Elvis went to Colonel Parker in desperation to say, can you manage her? And to keep in mind, Elvis had always enjoyed Colonel Parker to himself. So so when it came down to love and it came down to managing, this is the decision that was made. So here we go. Elvis and Anne Margaret romance headlines were everywhere. While her career was going well, she was nowhere near the star he was. Elvis decided he wanted the Colonel to manage Anne as well as himself to boost her career. I'll even pay you extra, Elvis pleaded. The crafty Colonel immediately went into his, quote, negotiation mode. He calmly took the cigar out of his mouth, looked at it, stuck it back in, and lit it. It bought him time to formulate a response. Quote, no problem. I'll be happy to do it, he said. But the only way it can happen is for me to spend half of my time managing her and the other half with you. Elvis's eyes widened, and he thought for a moment. That arrangement wasn't going to work for him. You know, Colonel, it wouldn't be fair to expect you to work as hard as you do, and you'd have to manage her too, Elvis said. Let's just forget it.
Now that was very wise negotiating on his part.
Well, and he
very clever.
He was clever, and he could think of these things very quickly, and he was very quick on his feet and very nimble. And he would always formulate these responses that would make people think and make them think in ways of, they were deflections, but they were very, very wise deflections. So they were, he wouldn't necessarily turn somebody down, but he'd put Elvis's price out of the league to where they couldn't do the deal. So for example, Judy Garland wanted to do a Christmas album with Elvis, and Elvis didn't want to be disrespectful and say no to her, but he said, let's get our managers to talk to each other. And so he'd tell Colonel Parker, I don't want to do this. So then that was Colonel Parker's cue to put the price out of the ballpark. The same thing happened with the movie A Star is Born and Barbra Streisand. She wanted him to star in the movie. He thought about it. He'd have to lose all this weight. he didn't want to have to deal with John Peters. And so he just told Colonel Parker, ask for top billing, ask for this amount of money, ask for a percentage, and then it didn't happen.
Hmm. So it sounds as if Elvis got smarter the longer he worked with Colonel Parker. Was that true?
Yes, he did get wiser. Everything went through the colonel, but he certainly didn't get wiser when it came to his money.
Ah,
Or
No kidding.
say.
yeah.
Where did he
Now,
get the title Colonel?
what happened to the romance with Elvis and Anne Margaret?
What basically happened was Priscilla was always in the picture, but she was stowed
Okay.
away in Memphis. And she had been there since 1960. That romance happened in 64. And then Priscilla's father started leaning heavily on Elvis to marry her. And so it would have probably been a very big scandal if Elvis had not married her, because she was 14 when they first met, 16 when she was installed at his house. And, you know, they were leaning heavily on Elvis to marry her. So that's what happened to that romance.
Now, what surprised you most as you were researching and writing the book what surprised you about Elvis that would also surprise us?
Well, I'll first say this about Colonel. What surprised me the most about Colonel was how charitable he was. All the charitable endeavors that Elvis took on, they were really Colonel Parker's ideas. The USS Arizona that was first mentioned, that was all Colonel Parker's idea. I remember when he did the Aloha from Hawaii satellite, that they always picked a charity to designate the profits to, and in that particular case, it was a cancer one, and so that's what really surprised me. And Colonel Parker was also an Elvis lover. I'm sorry, he was an animal lover, and because he fell in love with the animals at the zoo. I'm sorry, not the zoo, the carnival, and so that was another thing. What surprised me about Elvis, I'd written several books on Elvis before, so nothing really surprised me other than just how irresponsible he was with his money, and how little respect he had for money, which is a shame, because a lot of people come away with this book with more respect for Colonel Parker and less respect for Elvis. That wasn't certainly my intention, but that's the reality of the situation.
Well, I have a couple more questions, but I will pass it over to Carl to manage the questions from the other attendees before we come back to me.
Okay.
Good. And your question is, okay, Carl, thank you. So let's see what the others have to ask.
Great. Okay. Who has a question?
Well, just a real quick question. How did he get the name Colonel?
That was a designation that there was I think it was a Louisiana governor that gave him that designation, and he took that and ran with it, and used it to promote himself, just like the boxing promoter Don King would use his shocking hair, or any producer would use. So that's how he got that. He wasn't a real colonel. However, he did serve in the Army, which a lot of people don't know. He served, I think, a 3-year stint in the 1920s. So when he got here, one of the first things he did was he served in the Army so that he could eat.
There's an organization called the Kentucky Colonels. I wonder if it may have been Kentucky governor.
I believe it was Louisiana.
Louisiana. Okay.
Okay. And Janelle has her hand raised.
Unmute,
okay.
Janelle.
There you go.
Yeah. I should get rid of these 4 computers. It really makes it difficult to move the mouse around. Here's my question. So the Colonel seemed to really understand money and how to work with it, and Elvis didn't. What caused Elvis's lack of respect for money? I didn't know that. And didn't working with the Colonel have any impact on him around his finances?
It didn't seem to be, but again, remember, Elvis established the relationship very early on, and that was, he said, you worry about the money coming in, and I'll worry about it going out.
Mhm.
The Colonel would basically find opportunities for them. Elvis would get paid, and then he allowed his dad, who had an 8th grade education and was incarcerated, to watch his money for him. Now, excuse me, I will say this: his dad was very uneducated when it came to investments and that sort of thing, so they didn't really have any. But he was also very tight with money, and he was forever on Elvis to stop spending.
And it didn't stick.
No, he got more rebellious because once he became more famous than his dad, it would have been and earned a whole lot more money than his dad. It was more of a form of rebellion. As a matter of fact, if you recall that famous picture of Elvis and Richard Nixon, the whole reason that he flew there evolved out of a fight regarding money. And so he had this fight with Priscilla and Vernon about money and how reckless he was. And he said, "I'll do whatever I damn please." He left the house, got on a plane, flew to Los Angeles, picked up his friend Jerry Schilling, and then they flew to Washington, D.C. And then they walk up to the gates of the White House, asking for a private audience with Richard Nixon. And he wants to get this badge. He was big into police badges, and he wanted to get this special collectible badge, and that's how he ends up at the White House. But again, it all evolved out of a fight regarding money.
All right. I'm gonna just jump on the backside of this. In the recent fictional biopic, Elvis, it shows that Colonel Parker is blowing all of his money gambling and
Right.
going deep, deep, deep into debt. Any truth to that?
Well, he definitely gambled, but his second wife, Loanne, told Greg McDonald that that he did gamble, but it wasn't anything that he couldn't afford. And Baron
Okay.
Hilton told Greg that he never ever compromised Elvis and serviced his contract. And he said to Greg, which is the first time I ever heard, he said Elvis and his dad were so desperate for money that he always required his money up front before he stepped foot in Las Vegas, meaning that there's no way that Colonel Parker could gamble, whatever proceeds that Elvis had made, because Elvis required it first before he stepped foot on the Vegas stage.
Okay. All right. Randall, you were up next.
Well, speaking of money, I understand that Elvis makes more money now than just about anybody else. Marshall, do you have any idea how much he's actually bringing in every year, or what happens to that money?
It fluctuates, but in the case of a lot of dead celebrities, they earn more now than they ever did in their lifetime, because it's the same with Steve McQueen. His estate earns about $10 million a year. Because Elvis had a great year with the movie, I think he earned, like, his estate earned like $50 million in the last couple of years. And sometimes, again, that usually fluctuates between 25 and 50. But usually Elvis is number one. Michael Jackson's up there too. Michael Jackson was another big spender. But now that he's passed away and all that excessive spending has stopped, his estate is now accumulated, to be worth 400 or 500 million.
Well, unfortunately, Will Rogers died too early, so he doesn't make any money.
But Forbes has this list of dead celebrity earners every year, and usually it's always the top 10 people: Elvis, John Lennon, George Harrison, James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, Steve McQueen, Prince.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Yes, 400 or 500 million for Michael Jackson. That's a lot of giraffes. You you can buy a lot of giraffes with that. Okay, next up is Janice.
I have two questions about the money issue. Number one, why didn't Colonel Parker or anybody else teach Elvis how to manage his money? And number two, the story you mentioned about him negotiating for a movie he didn't want to be on, why didn't he just say no?
Okay, I'll take your first one. Why didn't he teach him? Because Elvis, you had to know Elvis's personality. He didn't want anybody telling him what to do. You know, everybody thinks of him as a very nice, kind country gentleman, which he was. But there was another side of him that was very rebellious and didn't want to listen to anybody. I mean, the drug situation is proof of that.
Mhm.
You know, whenever Colonel tried to tell him about, you know, stocks and bonds and any sort of investments, he just didn't want to listen. He wasn't sophisticated enough, or maybe he was too intimidated to
Yeah.
try. But you know, he just, his attitude always was, I can always go on the road and make more money. That's what he told Sonny West, his bodyguard, who I did a book with. So, and then I'm sorry, your second question was, why didn't
he just say no to the movies? Why did he say, make a grandiose offer?
You mean that particular movie or the movies?
Any of them. You said his go-to response to these movies he didn't want to do was to just say, make an offer that's so outlandish they won't say yes. Why didn't he just say no, thank you?
Because he didn't want to be the bad guy.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of actors and celebrities that I deal with are the same way. Like, oh, you need to talk to my manager. Yeah, I'd love to do that book with you, but you need to talk to my manager.
Hey, this is Randall.
Thank you very much.
All right. Does anyone else have a question?
I have a burning question.
All right.
Blue suede shoes. The story goes that Johnny Cash served with a black airman in Germany who talked about don't step on my blue suede shoes. Johnny Cash gave that line to Carl Perkins, who wrote the song my junior year in high school. I was a big Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Chuck Berry, Little Richard.
I'm Randall Reeder. I just got a message.
What I'd like to know is whether Marshall, because the story goes that Perkins recorded Blue Suede Shoes in '55. It was a hit, but he was in a car accident and scheduled to go to the Ed Sullivan show.
Right.
But because he was hospitalized for months, Elvis went to the Ed Sullivan show and sang Blue Suede Shoes that he recorded a year later. So Marshall, I only know this anecdotally. Have you researched that at all?
That is true, because I wrote a book on Johnny Cash and I know that story intimately. And it wasn't necessarily Elvis.
You're muted.
Oh, Marshall, what happened? We've lost you, Marshall. Hold on. I'll get you back on. If I can find you.
Okay. I hit on mute.
There you go.
That was my fault. Sorry. I was trying to unmute somebody else. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so it wasn't a matter of Elvis stealing Carl Perkins's opportunity. It was a matter of, and the way I wrote it in the Johnny Cash book is that Carl Perkins had a hit and then woke up in obscurity because, you know, once he got into the car crash, he was out of the scene for about 9 months. And as you know, audiences are fickle. And so that's exactly what happened.
Okay. Any other questions? I'm hearing someone out there. Hugh is.
Right, well, let me jump in with the rest
Yes.
of mine.
Good.
And I will stop as soon as Carl, if you see another hand up. One, I assume we would read this book and come away a bigger fan of Colonel Parker.
That's correct.
Will we think less of Elvis?
It depends, I guess, how you look at money. And it's hard to answer that because you're talking about a man who was in the throes of addiction
Yeah.
and at the end of his life. And so and again, we don't sugarcoat it. So I
Yeah.
think it just all depends, how you view, I guess, how he treated money, how he treated himself, how he
Yeah.
could really help himself.
Now, do you touch on the relationship with Priscilla and why they got divorced?
Yes, and that was fairly evident. The fact that he was forced to marry her. He loved her, but the consensus, and I've interviewed women who had affairs with Elvis, long-term affairs, who basically said he was not a man who should have ever been married. He should have made himself available, and he basically did to women. I mean, he belonged. He had no business getting married because he wasn't going to be faithful. Is the
Yeah.
bottom line. And he didn't get married again. He had opportunities, but he didn't.
Mm. Now, I don't know if our fellow Golden Gate Breakfast Club remember how we met, because you were writing a book on Jay Sebring, my old boss, and that's how we met.
Right.
And that book, I believe, is now being sold and will be published next year.
Yes, we've talked to a publisher who's agreed to publish it. And we're also trying to package it as a podcast on Wondery or one of those platforms. And so we're in the last stages of just putting the final touches on it. And hopefully the publisher will get it in a month or two. And then, and Jay Sebring, for who everybody doesn't know, he was the first man who introduced men's hair to the United States. He was the Vidal Sassoon of our popular culture, and then he was killed by the Manson family trying to defend Sharon Tate. But the thrust of the story basically is that this guy created the men's hair care in the United States, which I believe now, Patricia, I looked it up, is like a $300 billion industry. So what he created, he never got to participate in. And then when he was killed by the Manson family, the press didn't take they weren't very kind to the victims, and they trashed this guy's reputation.
Yeah.
And so it was we say in the book that he was killed twice. And so what we're trying to do with this book is establish his reputation again, establish who he was, why he's so vital to our history, and perhaps maybe they can think of him other than a victim.
Yeah. Well, of course, he made a big difference in my life, because once Jay died, I became the star in San Francisco. So it was a great experience working for him and learning from him. And anyway, so more about that. And we certainly want you back when that's published. Now, what other projects? Because, as I said in your introduction, book, movies, and about Steve McQueen. So give us an update of what else is going on.
Well, I have 2 other books in the can. I did a book on a serial killer from Tucson, and I'm producing that as a documentary. His name was Charles Schmid. He committed his crimes in the mid-'60s. And so his widow kind of came out of hiding and said, I want to do this book with you. And so I thought, there aren't too many books on serial killers where the widow comes out and talks. So I did that book, and then I did a book on the recording history of a small recording studio in Georgia. And then this past week, if you guys are football fans, I just sat down with Dwayne Thomas. He was a running back with the Dallas Cowboys, who led them to their first Super Bowl. And he lives in all places in Sedona, Arizona, which is 2 hours from where I am. And so we're talking about doing a book. And then I'm also talking with a gentleman. His name is Johnny Stewart. And if you've ever been to Las Vegas, he started the Legends in Concert. And, where you have all the impersonators.
Right.
And so he's a very, very interesting character. He's very much like a Colonel Parker character. He's 82 years old, still got a lot of energy, wants to tell his story. So it's always interesting kind of what projects kind of come my way. Sometimes I seek them, sometimes I don't. But those are the two projects that I have on deck right now.
Well, Susan, who is unfortunately traveling today, sends her best. We are both very interested in hearing about the horrible serial killer. So give us a little teaser of why we will love to hear about that book.
Okay. Well, his name again.
And then Janice has another question.
His name was Charles Schmid, and he killed 3 girls, but he was in high school. He was considered, he modeled himself after Elvis Presley, but he was 5'3", and he had his hair greased back like Elvis, and he painted a mole on his face, and he put white toothpaste on his lips, and he'd do powder makeup, and he looked really strange and really weird. And again, we're talking the American Graffiti era. And he'd make up these incredible bold lies, and yet he drew women in like, he'd always go for the younger impressionable girls. And the interesting thing was that one of the people, the two girls were sisters, and they were the daughters of these prominent, the surgeon, and the surgeon happened to be Joe Bonanno's heart doctor, and he kept Joe Bonanno, mafia boss, alive. So we think that Bonanno had him killed in prison because he was stabbed 47 times, once through the eye. We think that was a message sent by the mafia, eye for an eye. So you have a serial killer being killed by a mafia boss, which is very bizarre. But nobody's really ever uncovered this. And the guy that is one of the people that killed him is still alive. We're trying to find him and try to have him confirm the story. But, we're talking about something that happened 60 years ago. Some of these people are still alive, some are not. And it's just interesting if you scratch the surface, what comes up.
And why did his widow want the book written?
She's still in love with him. Yeah, she was 16 years old when she met him, and so she wanted the real truth to be found as far as why he was killed. And she's very, very candid, and she understands his faults and understands what he did, but she's still in love with the guy. Yeah.
Well, let's face it, with the toothpaste on his lips, kissing him was minty fresh, wasn't it?
Very, very good. All right, Janice has a question.
Let me see it. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a picture. Well, I'm going to find the bizarre picture for you.
Yeah. Oh, good. And we have another guest from our chapter in New Mexico, Eva.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And then he had a fake bandage on his nose because he would tell people.
Oh,
wow.
That he had his nose broken.
Not exactly a magnet, is he?
The women loved him.
Yeah, geez. Okay.
So I have another double-sided question. One is, what are your criteria for your topics for your next books? And it sounds like part of it is interesting stories. And the second question, sorry for these double-loaded questions. The second question is, I hope when you write about murderers that you get into some of the for me personally, and I think others, the psychology behind what makes someone a murderer, like what leads to the first murder. Did they kill cats as children, and why? Did they hate their mother? I mean, what the heck creates a murderer?
Sure.
I know some of it is innate evil. I've read books about that, but in some cases, I think it's just distorted personal relationships.
Well, he certainly had one with his mother. He was adopted, and what we think happened is that he found out at age 18 that he was adopted. The mother didn't tell him, and then he went kind of berserk. But the first kill was just a thrill kill. He wanted to see what it was like.
Yeah, but why? Why would somebody want to see what killing is like?
He was a daredevil. He did all these sorts of weird things. He'd jump out of planes. He was always kind of pushing the limits. And then he felt like that was the next natural progression. But to answer your question about criteria, to me, it just has to interest me. That's the criteria. You know, if it's, and that's all we as writers can go on. If we feel like something's interesting, we got to go with our gut. What makes
Yeah.
the story? So in that particular case, that was a story that kind of broke Tucson's innocence. Tucson was a very sleepy Western town, and this happened in 64 and 65, right when all the popular culture stuff is happening. You got the Cal Berkeley riots, the protests going on. You got the Beatles coming in, and it's just this whole pop culture swing. And
Mhm.
America's really starting to get dark. It's coming out of that innocence of the 50s. And then, so this particular crime really broke the innocence of Tucson, and they kind of have never recovered from it.
Yeah, very interesting.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of sub story of that. But the other thing too was no one knew why he was killed. He was killed by these two. He was actually he was set up for it looked to me like he was going to get paroled, and because he was a trustee, and people don't know this, but he was let out. He was taking care of the dogs in the prison, and he was let out, and his mother lived 10 miles away, and so he'd go visit his mother, and people were just horrified when they discovered this. So and then he broke out of prison. So every time he broke out of prison, the police would go to the victims' homes and protect, the parents. And so I personally think after the second, and he broke out of prison twice, after the second attempt, the father said enough is enough. And he called on a favor from Joseph Bonanno, because the guys who killed him lived in this they didn't live in the main area. They lived in a dormitory style place, which was very, very cushy. And so why would two guys who were his buddies suddenly, and one of them was up for parole in the next month, why would they suddenly turn around and kill this guy? Well, the rumor was they got paid $10,000 each, because the widow had an uncle in the place, and that's what he had heard. And
Wow.
so these guys admitted to it, but they gave some lame excuse as to why he did it. And but the interesting thing is we've scratched so hard that we found some things, 60 years later that people probably don't want discovered.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the most famous murders in the early 20th century, of course, was Leopold and Loeb, two college students who admitted they did the murder because they wanted to see what it was like to kill. They admitted it. So there's some funny people out there. Now we have some more questions. Leslie?
Marshall, when we were growing up, did you want to be a writer when you grew up?
No,
And I don't even remember you being a whiz English
I wasn't.
student. No offense, but
No,
I was
you're
on the
right.
geeky side. You were not.
My interest really was in sports, and
Right.
and that's where my identity was. And so but with that said, I think everyone that grew up with our generation, males I'm talking about, we were into sports, we were into movies, and we were into music.
Mhm.
And so when I worked for Charles Keating, and the government cracked down on him, I thought I was gonna have a career in business. And then when that went away, I was like, oh boy, what do I do now? And so that's when I decided, well, I've always wanted to write a book on Steve McQueen. But yeah, you're right. I didn't have any interest but I was always good in English, but I just didn't have any interest in academics. And here I am, I work for Arizona State University, and I write all these stories about academia, and it's really, really hard. But and that's why I like writing books, because it's like this is fun, this is easy. But yeah, ironically, I end up in academia.
Bravo.
And Carol, do you have a question?
Yes, what drugs did Elvis succumb to?
He had 14 in his system.
14.
He had,
Wow.
yeah, when he got prescription drugs, remember he doctor shopped and he was close. He kept, Dr. Nick was the guy that went with him on tour. So when he got drugs, he got industrial size pills.
Wow.
Tuinol, Seconal, what's the one drug they give to Dilaudid. Dilaudid is a drug that they give to last stage cancer patients. So that was one that he was on.
And why would he take that? Well, what did it do to him?
Well, one of his guys who was his Memphis Mafia just said, he goes, I'm just gonna be honest with you, Elvis just like getting effed up.
Okay.
So I personally think, and I hear this with a lot of entertainers, they entertain to thousands of people, then they come back to their hotel room and it's quiet, and that contrast, they just can't deal with that, they've got this natural high going on with the audience, and then they come back to their hotel room and it's quiet, and they're lonely and nothing's going on, so they don't know how to deal with it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've mentioned that in one of my presentations, that performers, it's that space in between the audience that is the killer. That's the tough part.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, 2 years ago, I'm friends with the guys in the group called Collective Soul. And they were big in the 90s, but I went to see them backstage, and I visited with them hours before the show went on. And so they performed in Las Vegas the night before, and then like after the show, they load in, everything's done by midnight or 1 o'clock, and they drive all morning to the show, and they sleep in the bus, and then hang out at the next venue all day. They can't leave, so they're in and out of the bus there, and I was just thinking, this is a terrible lifestyle. I wouldn't want this, and because they go in, they take their nap, then come back out, and then they have a couple of drinks, and then they go back, and it just I felt sorry for them, to be honest with you.
And every town is the same, because it's all on the bus.
Yeah, and they spend about 60% of their time on the road and 40% at home. So I can't. The contrast is just crazy.
Yeah, kind of understandable, really. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
They get 2 hours.
Oh,
They get 2 hours where they're on the stage, and the rest is waiting.
Yeah, exactly. And that high is so high when you're on the stage that the trip down afterwards is tough to bear. It is. Yep. Any other questions? Nope. Well, Marshall, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. A completely different view of the Colonel. When is this book released, or is it out now?
It came out in November.
It came out in November. Great.
Yeah.
And is it on Audible?
It's on Audible, and it's on Kindle.
Okay, great. So for everybody out there, look it up. This is finally something different about Elvis and the Colonel. That's great. Thank you, Marshall. We look forward to seeing you again with your next book.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. And with that, we will end the meeting. And thank you everybody for attending today. This has really been a fun one. Thank you.
Can I ask a question before you get off?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Has the book come out yet about Jay Sebring?
No, that'll be out in 2025.
I'll just make one comment. So when I got out of the Army in 1961, Jay Sebring was just opening up his place on Fairfax.
Right.
And I heard about it. And so I went there. Now a haircut then cost $1.50, but at Jay Sebring, she paid $5 or $6. I forget the number.
That's right.
And so I went in there, got my new hairstyle. And while I was there, I said, "Where's Mr. Sebring?" They said, "He's giving a class." We actually taught some classes. and would you like to go to the class? I said, okay. So they took me to the class, and I watched Jay Sebring give a class. He allowed me to be part of the class for no money and taught me how to cut hair.
Wow.
It was a wow.
Well, that's
Great.
well, you bring up something that again, he introduced concepts like franchising. So he didn't make money just cutting hair. He would teach, and then you would become a Sebring trained barber. So he made money that way. He would go to film sets and cut stars' hair and make money that way. He'd go to studio executives' homes, cut their hair. I mean, this guy was a real visionary and a trailblazer.
His partners were Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Bobby Darin.
Yeah, he would go to Vegas and cut the hair of a guy named Jack and Trotter. I think Patricia, was he in charge of the Sands?
You know, I don't know. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I got kicked out of internet and I'm back again. So I came in, he took over our salon in 1969, I think about March, and then he was killed in August.
Yeah.
But I know he was talking, he was talking about opening a salon in Las Vegas, because I thought, oh, well, that would be something that would appeal to me. Little did I know, years later, I would have a home there. Anyway.
Yeah, that's really where he got his start, because he cut Jack and Trotter's hair, and then Jack introduced him to Sinatra and the Rat Pack. And so every month he'd fly to Vegas and cut their hair. And they thought a Jay Sebring haircut was like winning the lottery. And then he went to LA, and then Kirk Douglas sought him out. He gave him the haircut for Spartacus. And then from the publicity of that, then Jay Sebring blew up.
Yeah. Jay Sebring was the first one to use a hair dryer on men's hair.
Yeah.
And he opened up a shop in San Francisco.
Right.
Well, the story was, the owner of the salon where I worked, Art Blum, was in PR, and he read in Playboy magazine that Jay Sebring wanted to open a salon in San Francisco, and Art Blum said, no, you want mine, because it was already created and it was spectacular. So it was a lot easier for him to step in. And I totally forgot this, but years after I met Art Blum, and he said, oh, I never forgot you and Frankie, my best friend who worked in the next booth. You stayed one Saturday afternoon after work and just cleaned the salon magnificently, so it would make a great impression when Jay Sebring came to check it out, which I couldn't remember till I was reminded. But Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward came to our opening party, and I remember picking up the phone and, hey, this is Steve McQueen. Can Jay go racing with me tomorrow? And I have to call all his clients and say, I'm sorry, Mr. Sebring's been called out of town on business. Anyway, so with that, I can leave you chatting. You're in charge, Carl. I have to go get ready for my presentation. So, Marshall, thank you very much. We look forward to inviting you to hear about the mass murderer and Jay Sebring in the future. Okay. So goodbye, everybody, and I will see the rest of you, and I pass it over to you, Carl, to be completely in charge.
All right. I love power. Thank you. All right. Well, while we're here, does anybody else have
unfortunately, I have to leave because like I said, my day job at ASU, and I do have an interview to do. So
very good
for having me.
Thank you. All right. Bye. Well, with that then, unless somebody has something to say, we'll And the meeting, and thank you all for coming on board. And our guests, let's see you again. We love to have you here.
Thank you.